we're happy to take questions for the next while, and I'll deal with the questions on the Q&A, myself, Jimmy and Gary. So you can raise your hand if you want to ask a question. I see Ailish Quinlan has her hand raised there. I'm not sure if you still have a question, Ailish. But fire away, and we'll be answering the questions on the Q&A as we listen to you. Is the effective rate for rental in a management company at 40% as opposed to 45%? I think, you know, it's 20%, 25%, or sorry, 20%, 25% in the company plus the 20% surcharge. So to me, they add up to 45.
Yeah, it's 25% and then 20% and 75%.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it gets you to an effective rate of 40.
So anybody else, please feel free to raise your hand.
There's Peter Wynn there.
Peter Wynn. You can talk, Peter. I think you just have to unmute yourself if you're. How are profits recycled through the property company after the property is sold and CGT is paid? You mean another property is purchased, reinvestment happens? Yeah, I think so, yeah. Unless there's another angle on that one. Still asks one in the Q&A. Great. There's one in the, Jimmy, the very first one in the Q&A. When he's supplying services relating to the movable property in the UK.
Yeah, I think this is to do with the narrative. I think the question is getting at the narrative that you put on a VAT invoice, where the reverse charge applies. If you're supplying a service to somebody in the UK, then that service is outside the scope of VAT altogether. So I don't think the narrative is required in that scenario. We can't be telling them how to apply VAT in the UK. So I don't think we used this with services to the US and stuff like that before, but no, I don't think the narrative is required because it's not an inter-community supplied service.
Lauren Robinson. How are you, Lauren? Just unmute yourself there. Lauren Robinson. You just need to unmute yourself. It's in the bottom left-hand corner, Lauren. Just, yeah, you click over the microphone. Mark Quinlan, do you want to talk about that one, Gary? Do the dividends paid from property rental going up to the whole company be subject to closed company surcharge?
Yeah, probably. It depends on, like you're into the election and stuff like that. But typically, yeah, it's difficult to avoid it, yeah, unless you have a non-resident or you have some statutory bar on distributing, because you have sufficient reserves or similar. Because what you do is you just move it from the bottom company up to the top company.
Yeah. Pat McDermott, on a property related topic, trans-border relief for income tax purposes, i.e. cross-border workers. One of the conditions is the work performed in the state must only be incidental. During these COVID, these rules were relaxed. Since lockdowns, employers are allowed to retain staff. This means the duties of a foreign employment now being carried out in ROI. Any likelihood of changes to the conditions of the relief? I think we just have to wait for tomorrow, and even tomorrow it's probably not going to be announced in the budget. It'll probably be in the Finance Act, so there's nothing there at the moment.
I think it's one of those areas where old legislation isn't keeping pace with new working practices.
Yeah.
But it's an area that Revenue are quite hot on. If they think there are duties being carried out here, they are looking for their slice of the POA, typically.
Yeah.
So a lot of people who are living in London, say, came back here and are now working for the UK employer while here. That should be subject to UK POA according to the rules. And I think there's revenue guidance on that as well.
Yeah. Siobhan McCreesh, if a UK resident owns an Irish rental property, can they transfer ownership to a UK company? I think they can, but just be aware that the transfer of the shares derive their value from Irish property, so they'll be subject to stamp duty on the transfer and possibly CGT if they've increased in value. So there's potential charge there on stamp duty, and which wouldn't be too bad if it was residential, but 7.5% for non-residential could be an issue. Does the UK company have to operate by an Irish branch? That's something, Gary, I'm just thinking about. You know, if you have a UK company now owns an Irish property, and it used to be income tax 20%, is the CT now 25?
Yeah.
And a final CT, or is it a surcharge as well?
No, if that company is UK resident, I think it's a non-resident landlord effectively.
Yeah, so
for the close company.
I think actually owning Irish property through a UK company then might limit it to 25% potentially.
Yeah. But the company would have to be UK tax resident.
Yeah.
So if you had Irish resident directors, etc., you'd be into treaty typewriter and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, which wouldn't be bad, because then you'd have 19% UK CT with credit for the Irish 25% CT, which that would be a bad result. So 435 doesn't apply to treat a UK company as a close company. It'd be a close company if resident in Ireland in a group structure. Yeah, I think what Francis McNulty is getting at there is the 172D3, which is the withholding tax on a company that's managed. You know, if the UK company is managed and controlled, or has Irish people controlling it, potentially then it's still within the DWT when the Irish company pays a dividend to the UK company. So I mentioned that already.
Yeah, that's a change. That's a Brexit imposed change, because you were relying on an old EU directive because the UK has left the EU. You now look through and you've ultimately Irish beneficiaries at the top. You can't get the protection of that legislation, and you're into a treaty claim.
Yeah,
that's the issue, Francis.
Francis, you have your hand raised, so do you want to talk? Do you want to talk there, Francis? Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Talk away there.
Yeah. Sorry. What I was driving at there. Now I haven't looked at this in detail. Is that section 430 subsection 5? My understanding of that provision was to bring back in a group structure with a non-resident holding company back into the closed company provisions, by basically saying that if that UK holding company would be a close company, if it were resident in Ireland, then that holding company is actually treated as a close company. So therefore, what you would have in the group structure is a deemed close company owning a close company. So you wouldn't actually be outside the close company net, as it were. I wasn't really driving at the dividend withholding tax position, although I agree 100% with your analysis of the dividend withholding tax. But what my concern would be is if you set up a structure with a UK company to hold an Irish close company, that you haven't actually got yourself out of the close company net, because you'd still be deemed to be owned by a close company.
Get you. Yeah, good point.
Yeah. And the EU directive, you could rely on the parent subsidiary directive no longer applies. So obviously you could, if you had a problem under domestic law, go to a higher law, which would be EU law. And that no longer applies because the UK, as I think we know, has probably left the EU at this stage.
Definitely has. So what I'm thinking of is, if you're involved, if you have clients that had used a UK company or another a treaty company to get around the surcharge, you probably want to look at that.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah, might be possible, as we were saying there, to look at having the properties directly owned by the UK company, with the UK CT and the Irish CT being 25%.
Yeah, but I think your planning point on clearing out the reserves, and again, I agree 100%, that will have to be done before the year end, and that's really the trick, the practical problem of being able to estimate the correct amount of dividend that has to be paid up, say if you've got 31st of December year end on the 30th. shall we say? Because if you overestimate the dividend up, then you've got potential of an illegal dividend, and you'd have to look at what the tax consequences that flow from that. And obviously, if you underpay, then you've potentially got a closed company surcharge. Then.
Gotcha.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
Okay, Francis. Thanks very much.
Okay, unmute me now. Thank you.
I'll mute you again.
Thanks, Francis.
Oh, mute me. Yep.
So the property sold, which is being rented, if the property was the PPR until prior to renting, then rent for 4 years. Is it correct that if there is no gain, no loss from the purchase price to the sales price, there is no CGT liability? Do you see this one, Gary?
Yeah, that's just. I think the question is if there's neither a gain nor a loss, either through the calculation rules or monetarily, then there can't be CGT liability whether PPR applies or not.
Yeah.
I think you're just back to the basic calculation rules, and if there's no gain, then the fact that it was partially PPR becomes a kind of a moot point because there isn't a gain in the first place. I think that's the answer. But if I misinterpreted that, just please come back and clarify. I think there's another hand raised there, Alan.
Yeah. Somebody's raising their hand and putting it down again. Yeah, I think we're good. I mean, if everybody's happy, we can wind it up. You know, it's a complex area. Property transactions, so many different taxes: stamp duty, CAT, capital gains tax, corporation tax, surcharges. You know, and of course VAT. And probably the most dangerous one of all is VAT. You know, so if you do have any VAT queries, obviously Jimmy is your man. And if you'd have any other queries with surcharges, whatever, obviously Gary's the man. I'm retired from consultancy, thank God. What I would say to you, actually, just in case people haven't noticed, I sent out a blog last week in relation to Tax World, and for people who haven't seen it, I'll just give a quick look at it. So on the Tax World website here, you can go to company blog, and you can see here different things that I'd be commenting on each day. But here, there's now available on the Tax World website all the tax guides going back to 2003, and all the finance acts going back to 98 with annotations. So you can download these as PDFs, etc. And you don't need to be logged in to get them. So even if you're not a member of Tax World, you can still get them.